Welcome back. We are working on our slider web interaction component. In this lesson, we're going to be wiring up some JavaScript to allow the user to have control over our slider and our slide position. We added some styles, if you recall, in the last lesson to basically allow the user to manipulate this left percentage value on the dot slides element, and that's going to allow users to scroll our slides back and forth pretty easily. So we essentially want to create a new web interaction component that's going to go and select this slides element and then just move its left position back and forth. So that means inside of Visual Studio Code, we'll open up our app.js file, which is currently empty, but we also want to create a new component file for our slider. So let's right click over here and hit new file. We'll call it slider.js. Inside of this file, we will export class slider. And let's make sure in our app.js we actually instantiate that. So let's import slider from slider. And then we'll create a new instance. So const sliders equals new slider, like so. And as always, in our web interaction component, we are going to create a constructor, which is going to accept some options. And this will set this.config to object.assign. We'll have some default options like the attribute, which by default we can set to data slider, I guess. That'll work. And we could have, I don't know what else we're going to have, but maybe just as a basic sort of event, lifecycle event that will occur, we could probably have an on-slide event, which will do something whenever you set that callback. And then we, of course, override these default options with the options that are passed in through this constructor method. So let's add some JS doc here real quick. Again, I'm not going to go through the trouble of doing all the type definitions in JS doc. You certainly could do that just like we did with our toggle in the previous exercise. So for now, we'll just kind of add some JS doc things here to give us some documentation along with this. And I'll probably add the full JS doc definitions to the final source code. So if you just want to click on the source code link in the video description below, you should be able to find all of that good stuff, just in case you want to just copy and paste that and not have to build it yourself. But anyway, let's set this to component configuration options. Component. There we go. And then this is going to instantiate a new slider, and it will return, of course, a slider. This.config is going to be the slider component configuration. I can't type the word component today. It's going to be trouble. We're probably going to have to type that a lot. Let's set this to options. Type as options. And then we'll have to initialize. I can't type anything today, so that's even more trouble. Let's initialize the component, this.init, and return this. Right, so that's the same thing we sort of do in all of our components, just kind of some boilerplate stuff. We'll have an init method down here, and let me scroll down a bit so we can keep that in view. This is going to initialize component and return void. And just like in our sortable, we'll have some state variables, so like this.state equals some default value. I don't know what's going to be in state just yet, but we'll just set this to component state, which could have a type definition of state if you wanted to create that. And we'll just leave that as an empty object for now. And then we will, of course, set up our event listeners. So this would be where we'd set up any event listeners that we want to have for this particular component. All right, so at this point, we could add some event listeners and just start doing stuff. But honestly, in most of our lessons, when we start building out these components, I go through it in what I would call an atypical order whenever we're doing this, just to kind of logically explain things to you guys, because that's how we educate, right? You kind of have to walk through the whole process, and maybe I show you like the dumb way to do it first, and then we kind of go back and fix it later on. But I think we're far enough in this class at this point that we can kind of flip that on its head and actually build this as I would build a real component from the get-go. So normally, I wouldn't kind of just willy-nilly create some event listeners, and then as I'm figuring out what it's going to do, just kind of move things around. Normally, what you're going to do is kind of really think about the state of your component and build your methods around that. Build your methods around this idea of when the state is this, I want to do this, or when the state is that, I want to do this. And I think the biggest thing with a slider that you have to consider in terms of its state is, first of all, which slide are you on, right? Which slide are you looking at? So we could call that the index, which we can default to 0. That'll just be a 0-based index that tells us, are you on the first slide, the second slide, or the third slide? So that's the most important piece of state, I would say, that we want to set. But we can also perhaps say that it's probably a good idea to know the length or the number of slides. So we can also add a length, which will default to 0. And that's going to give us the number of slides, because we're going to need to do things like check to make sure that when you're navigating to the right, you can't go too far, right? Because if you only have 3 slides, then we can't go and try to look at a fourth. We need to know what the length is in order to clamp those values. And then finally, I want to reference to the slider element itself, right? So we kind of have this idea of a slider container, which is this outer div. And then the thing that we actually want to manipulate is this UL with a class of slides. So we probably want an HTML reference to each one of these elements in our state as well. So let's add a state variable for slider container, which will be null by default, as well as the slider itself, which we'll initially set to null. And let's sort all these so they're in nice alphabetical order. And I think that's gonna be a good starting state. This is really the essential piece that we want to focus on with our slider is how are we going to handle these 4 elements of state. That's going to give us some basic functionality for our slider. And now that we have this, most of the time when you're dealing with a global event listener, and which we often do in all of our web interaction components, you could potentially have multiple of these on a page, even multiple ones that are connected to the same instance. So in that case, you kind of need to think, well, when you click on a button that pans to the right, for example, I need to be able to go and get the index, the current index, get the current length, get the current slider element, and get the current slider container. I need to get all those things from each click on that global click listener. And so what I typically would do once you define your state and you have a global event listener like we're going to be using here, is I would create a method on this class, and you could call this whatever, but we could call it, for example, load state. And I'm going to pass this method, this load state method, some sort of HTML element. And what this is going to look like is basically we're going to have an HTML element that's going to serve as kind of the starting point, but this is the element from which to begin traversal to find slider state. So this is kind of, you're passing it any element that's inside of our slider container, and then we'll figure out the rest of the state from there. So you're just giving it a starting point, and then we'll call the method, we'll call it load slider state from child element, from given child element. And then I think that's going to be nice and clear. This will return void. So basically what we're going to do is, starting at any element that's inside of the slider container that we've been given, let's first of all find slider container. So this.state.slider container is equal to element.closest. And then we want to have a config option that's going to allow us to create a selector for our slider container, which again in index.html is just div with a class of slider. So let's set that up as a default value. In our config up here, we'll add slider container is going to be .slider, like so. And then now that we have this as a config option, we can come down here and this.config.slider container, like so. And then that's going to find the closest slider container. If that is falsy, meaning it couldn't find it, it's probably because we're using this wrong, right? We called load state in a weird way, or we did something weird that didn't work. So maybe we can just throw new error, slider not found, and then we'll also pass it the element. Slider not found from element, like so. And whoops, not throw new error, throw new error. So that'll throw an error and kind of stop execution, because you really shouldn't be passing in an element that is not inside of a slider container. So that'll take care of any errors there. And then we can also, now that we have the slider container, we can find its slider element. And again, we'll probably want to use traversal because again, you have the slider element and we want to find the UL with a class of slides that's inside of that. So we could, a number of ways to do this, but maybe we just call this slides. What do we call that down here? The slider itself. We'll just call this slider, it'll be .slides, like so. And so again, that's this .config.slider. That's the selector for the slider itself, which we will then, in our load state method, find slider. So this .state.slider is equal to this .state.slider container .query selector this .config.slider. So it's going to run a query selector on the slider container to find a slider within the container itself. And again, just like we did up here, if that's not found, then that means your HTML is kind of messed up or something's not working right. So we'll just throw an error. And up here, we should probably say slider container to make sure that's nice and clear. Slider container not found from element, and then slider not found in container, and then we'll pass in the this .state.slider container, like so. Oh, and you know what? In an error, I'm thinking console.log, which is why I added comma here. I think with an error, you can only add a message, so we don't actually need to pass this second argument in these. It'll give us a call stack anyway, and that's only going to throw an error if you did something wrong. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. There's a lot of different ways to do error handling. It's kind of beyond the scope of this course. This is one way to do it. We did. You can do console.error to just log stuff and let people know when things happen. There's all sorts of ways that you could potentially do error handling, which I kind of I don't want to get into at the moment. So we'll just kind of do a simple throw error at the moment in case you don't find anything. Another thing to do is kind of what we've been doing in most of our lessons is maybe what I should have done here, but I don't know. I'm just kind of following my stream of consciousness. But you could also just set the state variables to null. And in all the methods that use like this .state.slider, you just check to see if it's null before you do anything with it. So that's another simple option as well, which is normally what I do, but we're just exploring new things today, right? This is fun. So let's, now that we have our slider, what are the other elements of state we need to get, right? We need to get the current index and we need to get the length of the slides. The length is actually really easy. So let's do that first. We'll say get slider length, and we'll say this .state.length is equal to this .state.slider child element count. What is that thing? MDN child element count. There's a property on there. Yeah, it is child element count. This is why you need to do type definitions so you get some nice Intellisense so you didn't have to come look it up. But you see here, there's this thing, you just say .child element count and it gives you the length. You could also do .children.length. That's another way to do it, but I usually, when you're just getting the length, this is already available right on that HTML element. So there we go. We have our slider length. And the last thing is to get current slider index. So that is a little more tricky because, again, the slider index is going to be based on this left position. So if I'm at -100, then I want to make sure the slide index is 1, right? Because it's a zero-based index. So I'm looking at not at 0, but 1, the second slide in our slides here. So it goes 0, 1, 2. If I'm at -200, obviously I want the slide index to be 2. So we kind of just need to do a little bit of math on this left property of our slides itself to allow us to, we can do some rounding just in case later when we implement touch and we're kind of swiping things left and right, and maybe this isn't going to equal exactly 200 because it's animating or being swiped or something like that. Let's just create a little method that'll basically, you can pass it the slides, which will already be in state, so we won't necessarily have to pass that. But it's going to go to the this.state.slider. It's going to look at that left position of the slider, and it's going to do a little math to figure out what our current index is. So we'll call that this.state.index is equal to this.getSlideIndex. And then we'll obviously have to create a method called getSlideIndex, which will accept nothing and this will get current slider slide index, and this is going to return a number because it's going to get the current zero-based index. So the first thing we want to do here is get that left position value. So what we can do there is we'll just say get left value const. Well, let's do a let, because I think we're going to change this in a moment. But let left equal slider.style.left. So that's how you can access the left property. And sorry, it's not slider, but it's this.state.slider.style.left. But you can access all of its style properties using .style, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff. Unfortunately, I don't have my Intellisense because I didn't create the type definition here. But if we were to do like, let me just show you the Intellisense. So if we were to put param HTML element slider, and if I were to do slider.style, you can see if you go all the way to the top here, there's a whole bunch of styles that you can get on an HTML element. And basically, just about everything you can do in CSS, you can access through this style property. So like the color, all kinds of stuff, just tons and tons of stuff. But you'll see style.left is going to access the CSS style declaration.left property, and it just gives you a string. So that's important to understand. This is actually a string. It is not a number value. You're going to have, essentially, this is going to, when we get left is going to equal a string that's like that, 100% or negative 100% or 0% even, or whatever. And even this could potentially be undefined, because if it's just in your style sheet and you haven't previously set it with CSS, then it's probably going to be undefined. So we can change this to we can add an or statement and just add 0% maybe as like a default value. And that will say, if this is undefined, let's just use this value instead, which again is a string. So I want to make sure that we are parsing a string, because we need to be able to transform this string into a number that we can actually do some calculations on. And so what we can do next is, in order to transform this to a number, we can say left equals parse int. So we can parse an integer from the given string, which is a very handy little method that we can use to basically turn a string into a number. But first, I want to make sure that we take the left and we remove the percentage sign, or even a net, like if it had a negative 100, I want to remove any dashes that are negative, and I want to remove the percentage signs to just leave the number. So that's just going to be a simple string replace. So we'll do left.replace, and then we can use a little regex expression here to do /%/g. So it'll globally remove the percent character, and we'll replace it with this. And then we could also do, I could do this in the same statement, I guess. I think it's the or you put them in brackets maybe. I forget. Let's do that. Let me do a test on this cool. There's this really cool site, Regexer. Definitely bookmark this if you don't have it. It's so good. I use it all the time because I have never been able to memorize all the regex things. But let me paste in that thing I came up with, and then you basically just type in a bunch of things like -200, a bunch of examples of how you might use this, and it's going to highlight what it selects, and it even gives you these awesome tool tips. You can change it to replace mode, and maybe I replace it with nothing, and you can see it's doing exactly what I want. So that is the correct regex expression in this case. It is taking these values and it's turning them into simple numbers with no decorations on them, which is great. And they even have these awesome like cheat sheets over here that give you info about all the regex stuff. So if you've never used regex and you need a little help, or if you're like me and you've been using it for like 20 years, but you just can never remember all this stuff because you don't use it often enough, then bookmark this regexer.com. I'll put a link to this in the video description. It's really awesome. Use it all the time. But anyway, so that looks like the correct regex expression there. So we can make sure that it's going to replace both percentages and dashes and replace them with an empty string or nothing. So it's going to remove those basically. And then finally, let's round to nearest 100. So we're going to, well, we're not really rounding to the nearest 100. We're going to round to nearest index, I guess is a better way to say it. Because what we're going to do is we're going to return math.round left divided by 100. So if we were passed a value here, this .state.slider.style.left, if it was negative 100, it's going to return 1, right? Because at negative 100, we're viewing the second slide, which has a slide index of 1. If we were at negative 200, this left value is going to equal 200. We're going to divide that by 100 and round it, and it's going to end up being 2. So again, the third slide is going to have a zero-based index of 2, which will be returned by this method. And that's exactly what we want in this case, if I'm doing this right in my head. So we'll see in a moment. But anyway, so we're going to set the this.state.index to this.getSlideIndex, and theoretically, that should work. So we have finished our load state method. You can pass it any element. It's going to find the slider container, the slider. It's going to get the current length and the current slider index, and we'll be good to go there. So all of that stuff will work just fine. And we also want to make sure that in addition to loading the state, we have a method that will set the state. In other words, it will update any DOM elements that need to be updated based on the current values that we have in this state: index, length, slider, and slider container. So let's do that now. Right above load state, I don't know where I should put this, but I like to keep set state and load state right next to each other for some reason. But we'll go to set state here. This doesn't need to accept anything because it's just going to update these two elements that we have in our state. So what it's going to do is, first of all, check to see if you have a slider. If this.state.slider is falsy, just return, because we don't have a slider. So what does it matter? So let's not do anything. Oh, and I should put a JSDoc thing up here. So this will be return void and update slider state, like so. There we go. So once we have a slider, let's, first of all, it's going to be a good idea to clamp the index, because we didn't really do any checking down here when we're getting the slide index. We didn't check against the length. All we're doing is just basically parsing this style.left and then rounding it. So theoretically, a user could have gone in and manipulated the styles and set a left position of like negative 2000, which is going to give us a 20 as our slide index or whatever. And so we want to make sure that we clamp it, which is basically just saying, let's make sure that the slide index that we're trying to move to is between 0 and our slide length minus 1. So we'll do if this.state.index is less than 0, this.state.index equals 0, else if this.state.index is greater than or equal to this.state.length, because we also can't have it be the length, then we will do this.state.index is equal to this.state.length minus 1. And the minus 1 is, again, just because it's a zero-based index. So if we have a length of 3, the maximum index that we can have in state is actually going to be 2, because it's a zero-based index. And now that we've clamped the index, let's go ahead and set left position of the slider. So we'll say this.state.slider.style.left, sort of use that same style.left thing, and we'll just equal a template string, which will basically set the percentage. So what we can do here is we can say this.state.index times 100. So if the index is 0, this will end up being 0. If it's 1, it'll be 100. And we'll take that and we will actually multiply it by negative 100. Because again, just when we were playing around with this over here, you'll notice to move it to the second slide, we have to set it to negative 100%. If you were to do positive, they're just going to slide off the screen, right? And that's not what we want. So we actually need to go in the negative direction. So we'll do times negative 100, and then we'll just add a percentage sign on the end. So that's going to set the left position of our slider. And then down here could be where we fire the onSlide event. So this.config.onSlide. And we'll pass this.state to that. Cool, and I think that's it for set state. So, that's really the only thing that's really important with the state is that we're clamping the index and then we update that left position of the slider to that rounded index that we calculated in the load state method. So this doesn't do anything yet, and you may be wondering, well, why did we just go through all that work when it doesn't even do anything? And again, I'm kind of flipping this around this time. I didn't just go in and start building out event listeners, but I think you're going to see now that we created this idea of load state and set state, the rest of the event listeners that we need to add to our class, our web interaction component class that we have created, are going to be so much easier to do. So let me just show you an example of how we can utilize these load state and set state methods that we have created. So just as an example, let's go into our HTML file here and let's create a button that'll basically just go to the right. So we'll just focus on one button for now. We're not even going to style it up. Let's just go in here. Down at the bottom, we will create a new button, which will have an attribute of data slider next, or I guess you could call it right or left, but I don't want to force the presentation in here, so I'll call it data slider next. And then inside of this button, we'll just put like a next text there, which will be fine. And we probably give this a class, like class equals slider next or something like that. Yeah, and then we'll even surround this in div class equals slider nav or slider controls, whatever you want to call it. So we created a button, shows up down here. As you can see, we have this next button that currently doesn't do anything. And now that we have a data slider next in here, that's just based on our config attribute data slider. So I'll just add dash next onto the end of whatever that is. We can do that with a template string or something. But basically now that we have a button, we can add an event listener, and it's going to be so much easier to work with this. So let me just show you. If we do document.add event listener, click, and then capture the event and pass it to this dot click, like so. If we go down to the bottom of our method, now that we have this global event listener, the bottom of our class rather, and we add a click method to it, this is going to capture a, what do they call that? A mouse event, I think it was. Click event. Click listener. And inside of this method, we'll basically do the same thing we always do. So we can say not a data slider next click. So if e.target.matches, we want to make this falsy. So if it doesn't match, and we'll build a template string that'll basically do an attribute selector of this.config.attr dash next. So if you do data-slider-next, if it's not that, or it's not something inside of that, so with space asterisk, then return. And then we will get the button, const button equals e.target.closest, and then again, we'll build out that attribute selector of this.config.attr-next. So that'll get the button. Oh, and you know what? We don't even really need to do that because we built our load state thing just to accept any child element of the slider container, which I believe, this is in the slider container, this slider data slider next thing. So we don't even need to do that bit of traversal. That's just kind of redoing what we're about to do anyway. But first of all, what we want to do is load slider state. So we can say this.load state. And we'll pass in e.target because whatever you clicked on, again, is going to be within the container. So that's going to load all the state into our this.state object just by calling that. All we have to do is say, hey, we did something with some element that's inside of the container. Now go get the state of our slider. And then we can say update state this.state.index ++. So we're just going to increase the index whenever you click on data slider next, and then we will set state this.set state. That's all we had to do in our click listener. If this works, I don't know if this is going to work. Let's try it. It sure does. So I can just click next, and it's navigating to the right. We haven't added a previous button, so you have to refresh if you want to try it again. But you'll see it even does the animation between those. So just by adding, like, look how simple this click listener is. It's 4 lines of code. All of the stuff, all of the magic is handled in our load state and our set state method. All we have to do is load the state when some event occurs. When we are listening to events, we update the state and then we run set state. And these two methods basically do everything. All we have to worry about is the new state of the slider. And we don't have to worry about DOM manipulation or traversal or anything like that because it's basically already handled for all of the listeners that we're going to want to do stuff in. And this is going to be a much nicer way to approach your components, because if you really just focus on that state management, all your event listeners are doing are just tweaking the state a little bit. And then your state management methods are handling all the hard stuff, what I would consider the hard stuff, which is DOM manipulation and all that stuff, traversal and all that good stuff that we've been doing throughout the course. But if you kind of just do that first, you're going to find your listeners get really, really simple, which I really like. And I just like this approach. I think it's going to be easier to do. And just like that, we created a next button. And we could very easily add a previous button. So let's do data slider previous. And we'll add slider prev class to this. And so you see it added a previous button, and all we'd have to do inside of our slider thing is I guess there's a couple of ways to handle this, but we could just update this to be const next click is equal to e.target.matches. So next click is going to equal that. So whether or not your target matches one of these selectors. And the same thing for the previous click. I'm going to put previous click first just because in the HTML it's first. Prev click equals e.target.matches -prev for previous. And so we'll update this to be data slider star click. So if you clicked on previous, prev click will be true. Otherwise, it'll be false. If you clicked on previous, then we don't actually need to do this second check here. So let's also do prev click and, because if you clicked on previous click, then this will be truthy. Then you don't need to do this dot matches down here because you know you clicked on a previous button. So that just avoids another dot matches, which is going to be a little more performant. And now that we've checked both of these, we can basically say, let's actually change this to determine click type. And then down here, we'll paste this comment, which is not a data slider star click. And then if prev click and next click are both falsy, then we can return, because then we know we didn't click on either one of those buttons. And if we've gotten to this point, that means we're good. So we'll prevent default click, e.prevent default. We will then load slider state, update the state. We're not just going to add, so we need to make sure that if prev click this dot state dot index minus minus, else this dot state dot index plus plus. So we're either going to increase or decrease, and then we're going to set the state. And just like that, we have our left and right navigation. Check that out. Pretty cool, huh? And you'll notice in the HTML up here, it's actually updating the style live as an inline style inside of our application, inside of the DOM and the HTML. And every time you're clicking on a button, it's doing the thing where it's loading the state, it's finding the closest slider container, and it's doing all that good stuff. But now, like I said, our event listeners are going to be nice and simple. We simply just kind of determine which direction we want to go, essentially, and we can just let our load state and set state methods take it from there. Great, so I think that's going to do it for this lesson. We're going to continue to improve this. We're going to add some new functionality, and we're going to do a little bit of styling of these previous and next buttons in upcoming lessons. So stay tuned. We'll check that out in just a few moments.